Hi, this is Chris with Nightfall Audiobooks, and I have for you something a bit different today. Thrift Store Horror is my collaborator on the channel. I use them for resources on what to read next and how to get books that I'm missing. And in some cases, I'm tracking down the wrong book entirely because it's the UK release and I already have the United States release. Anyway, recommendation was 13 Tales of Horror by 13 Masters of Horror. This is a compilation novel. It's all short stories. I have not read this before, but it came highly recommended by Thrift Store Horror. So we have stories by R.L. Stine, Caroline B. Cooney, Christopher Pike, D.E. Atkins, A. Bates, J. Bennett, Carol Ellis, Diane Ho, Lael Littke, Sinclair Smith, J.B. Stamper, Ellen Emerson White, and Patricia Windsor. Half of these authors have worked with Scholastic and Point Horror in the past. This should be pretty fun. And we all know about R.L. Stine and Christopher Pike, right? Believe it or not, I haven't really read any Diane Ho, or Sinclair Smith, or Caroline B. Cooney, but I do have a Cooney novel in the works, so stay tuned for that. I will be reading one story from this compilation and then publishing that as its own episode. I'm going to use this book like glue. If there's any holes or gaps or weirdness going on in my schedule, I'll be using one of these stories to fill that void. Just something fun to do. So let's begin. If you would like to get in touch with me, you can write me an email, nightfallaudiobooks@gmail.com. I am also on YouTube at Nightfall Audiobooks. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the join button to show your support. I also have a Patreon page, patreon.com/nightfallaudiobooks. So tell your friends, tell your mom, tell whoever you think would like to listen to me narrate them a story. Thank you very much for listening, and let's begin. Welcome to a Nightfall Audiobooks production of The Doll by Carol Ellis, from 13 Tales of Horror. The man had been out since sunrise, walking along the narrow strip of sand at the base of the rocky cliff. It was a beautiful place to walk, except for the garbage. Drivers up on the cliff road tossed down everything from greasy fast food bags to broken beach chairs. The man usually ignored it, but something caught his eye this morning, wedged in a wide space between two big boulders. Curious because it looked different from most of the stuff people dumped here, he walked over and pulled it out. It had been scratched up a little, and there was one big crack along the bottom, but it had survived the fall from the cliff top, which was something of a miracle. He slid his fingers over the latch, but it was tight, and his hands were cold. He sat down on a flat rock and blew on his fingers. When his hands warmed up, he'd try again. 3 months earlier, a few miles away from the cliff road, 16-year-old Abby Rogers and her family had moved into their new house. It wasn't new at all, really. Abby's mother, Denna, thought it must have been built in the 1870s, although it had obviously been redone several times. "It looks ancient," Lindsay grumbled. Abby's sister was 10 and thought everything old was disgusting, her favorite word for things she didn't like. "I still wish we'd moved into that condo. The swimming pool was fantastic." "And the condo was fantastically expensive," Denna pointed out. She hefted a cardboard box onto the small front porch and pushed her hair out of her eyes. "The condo didn't have any trees either," Abby said. "There's that huge one out back, remember, Lindsay? Maybe you can build a treehouse in it." Lindsay's frown faded. "Good idea," Denna said. She turned the key in the lock and pushed open the front door. "This is great, isn't it? Our first night in the house." Abby hadn't been crazy about moving. She couldn't do anything about it, though. Since her parents had divorced 4 years ago, making the payments on the old house had gotten harder and harder, and she kept reminding herself that it wasn't like they were moving out of town. She'd still go to the same school and have the same friends. She'd still wonder whether Mark Halpern would ask her out this year. Still, Abby had been reluctant to leave their old neighborhood, so she was surprised and a little confused by her reaction to the house. The first time she'd seen it, she felt drawn to it. She wasn't sure why. It was old and it sagged, and the yard was mostly weeds. But there was something about the steep roof and tall old windows, something that made her feel like the place was reaching for her. Once she'd seen it, she couldn't wait to move in. At dinner that first night, Denna flattened a paper bag from the deli and wrote a list of chores on it. Unstick the windows, paint every room, pull up the kitchen linoleum, clean out the attic. "I'll do the attic," Abby said without even thinking. "Are you sure?" Her mother looked at her curiously. "It's going to be baking hot up there, and it's completely unfinished. No windows. I thought you hated closed, stuffy places like that." "I'll still do it." Abby didn't blame her mother for being surprised. Small, airless rooms, elevators, closets always made her feel panicky. But the attic, even more strongly than the house itself, seemed as if it was pulling her to it. The next morning, shortly after her mother had left for work, Abby tied a scarf over her fine blonde hair, opened the hatch in the upstairs hall, and climbed up. Her mother had warned her about the heat, but Abby was still overwhelmed. It was like a living thing, thick and so heavy that she felt as if a hand were pressing down on her, squeezing out her breath, making her knees buckle, making her dizzy. She leaned against the flaking bricks of the chimney and closed her eyes for a moment. Sweat was already beading on her face and rolling down her sides in trickling rivulets. She wiped her arm across her forehead and tried to breathe slowly. From outside, she could hear the faint thump of a hammer on wood. Lindsay had started working on her treehouse. She heard the chirping of birds, too, and the occasional swish of a car. In a few more seconds, she opened her eyes. Sunlight crept in where the roof met the floor, and dust motes danced crazily in their shafts. A single bare light bulb hung from the center of the roof, its long string dangling within Abby's reach. She pulled on it, and a weak light spilled down into the middle of the room, leaving the far corners in shadow. The heat, the closeness, the thought of spiders, any of them would usually have made Abby give up before she'd even started, but something was waiting for her here. She could feel it, sense its presence in the airless shadows. With a strange sense of urgency, Abby waded into the piles of sagging cardboard boxes, stuffed paper bags, and rolled up rug remnants. She had to find whatever it was that was waiting. She searched for an hour frantically until her hands were black with grime and her clothes were covered with dust. At last she found what she'd been looking for. The moment she pulled it from a paper bag so old it shredded to pieces in her fingers, she knew this was it. In her hands was a rectangular wooden box, thick with dust like everything else. It was a handsome box, or would be, when the smooth wood and the tarnished brass catch were polished. Abby could feel an energy pulsing through the thick wood of the box and into her hands that shook as she fumbled with the catch and lifted the lid. Inside the box was a doll. Bedded on white satin that had yellowed with age, the doll lay like a small dead child. Its shiny black hair was piled high on its head, and its dress of lilac satin looked like something a woman would have worn 100 years ago. The skirt was long and full, the waist was tight, and the high neck and long sleeves were edged with lace. The dark-lashed eyes in the china face were as blue as the sky, as blue as Abby's, and they were wide open. The staring, sky-blue eyes seemed aware, alive, and filled with an emotion so powerful that Abby gasped. For a moment, she thought she saw hatred in those eyes. But it was only a moment. Abby blinked and lifted the doll from its box. The eyes were empty, lifeless. It was just an old doll with blue glass eyes glittering in the feeble light of the dingy attic. Later, after she cleaned out half the attic, Abby took the doll downstairs to her room. Smoothing its satin skirt, she put it on a long shelf where she kept a few stuffed animals, another doll her father had sent her from Mexico, 2 lopsided clay pots she'd made in art class last year, and a bunch of shells she'd found at the beach. The doll sat on the shelf like a queen, imperious and cold, its face turned toward Abby's bed. "I don't see what you want to keep it for," Lindsay said that night, after Abby had put the doll in place. "It's so old and disgusting." "I don't see why you care," Abby told her. She was lying on the bed, staring across at the doll. "But she happens to be beautiful. Mom thinks it might be an antique, maybe valuable. So why don't you sell it? I would." "I know you would," Abby said, "but I don't want to. Think of it this way, Lindsay. I just liberated her. She's a free woman now." "Yeah, right," Lindsay snorted. "Why don't you scram?" Abby suggested cheerfully. After Lindsay left, Abby switched out the bedside lamp and stretched out to sleep. The light from a street lamp filtered in through the thin curtained windows, and across the room, Abby could see the doll's eyes shining in the shadows. The eyes wouldn't close. Her mother said they must be stuck, probably because they were so old, or maybe they were never meant to shut. The only way to know would be to take the doll's head off, but it was delicate, and there was always the chance it might break. Abby couldn't do that, any more than she could have left the doll in the attic. Now that she'd found it, she couldn't risk destroying it. She'd just have to live with the doll's strange, staring eyes. School started a week later, and so did Abby's dreams. She thought, at first, that it must be all the changes in her life. New house, new room, new classes. By the time Abby learned the true cause of the dreams, it was too late. She tried to forget the dreams, but they stayed with her, shadowing her days like clouds and keeping her awake late at night, staring across the room into the doll's sightless eyes. The dreams were eerie, strange little scenes that made no sense, but filled her with dread as she watched, twisting and turning in her sleep. But it was what happened after she woke up that was so frightening. She began to wonder if the face looking back at her from the mirror every day was an Abby she'd never known, and Abby who dreamed of danger but was powerless to stop it. The first victim was her friend, Erin Gray. It was Friday night, the end of the first week of school. Erin was sleeping over at Abby's after the two of them had gone to the movies. Before they went to sleep, around 1 in the morning, Erin tried to convince Abby that Mark Halpern wasn't her type. "I know he's cool," Erin said from her sleeping bag on the floor, "but he never sticks with anybody. He's with a new girl every week." "Well, I don't want to marry him, Erin," Abby said. "I just want to date him." "Oh, Abby." Erin stood up and walked across the room. She took the doll down from the shelf and absentmindedly turned it over in her hands while she talked. "You know you'll be miserable when he dumps you." She was flipping the doll up and down. "What's wrong with this thing? Its eyes won't close." "It's a doll, not a thing, and I don't know why," Abby said. "Anyway, you're wrong about Mark. I just don't want to see you get hurt, okay?" Erin plunked the doll back on the shelf and snuggled into the sleeping bag. "I also don't want to have to say I told you so." Abby laughed and switched out the light. A few moments later, Erin's sleepy voice came wafting up from the floor. "Abby?" "Huh?" "That doll's eyes give me the creeps. Do you mind if I turn it around or something?" "Go ahead." Abby watched sleepily as Erin moved across the room, her long white t-shirt a pale blur in the shadows. As Erin came back, Abby's eyes were drifting closed. For a second, she woke again with a jerk, feeling an icy touch on her back, a touch that made her shiver even though the room was warm. But then the touch was gone, and Abby sank into a deep sleep. She saw a hand, a small, pale hand out in the hall. She didn't know or couldn't see what it was doing, but she knew it was the hall outside her room, because she recognized the peeling, ivy-patterned wallpaper that they hadn't stripped off the walls yet, and the painted baseboard that her mother wanted to sand down to the original wood. The hand was delicate and fine-boned, a girl's hand. Like a pale, fluttering moth, it hovered near the floor at the top of the stairs for a moment, then pulled back gently into darkness. Abby woke up to the sound of a scream. The room was dark, but a sliver of light came from under the door from the hallway, and she heard muffled voices out there. It was Erin talking to Abby's mother. Abby swung her legs over the side of the bed and went to the door. "It's okay. I'll live," Erin was saying. "I think." "What happened?" Abby blinked in the hall light. "Are you all right? I heard you yell." "You yelled too if you almost broke your neck," Erin said. "I wanted to get a drink, so I was going to go downstairs, but I didn't make it to the top step even." She bent over and rubbed her knee. "I tripped." "On what?" Abby's mother was looking around the top of the stairs. "There's nothing to trip on." "I don't know," Erin frowned, "but something was there. I felt it." The three of them stared at the top of the stairs, then at each other. Abby felt something nudging her memory, some thought or image, but she couldn't catch hold of it. Finally, they all went back to bed. "That was scary," Erin said, as she lay back down on the sleeping bag. "But at least I didn't fall all the way down. Those stairs are steep." "I know, I'm glad you're all right." Abby got in bed and closed her eyes, then opened them again when Erin got up. "What are you doing?" "Turning this doll around," Erin said from across the room. "I thought you already did that." "I did, but I guess it slips because I can see the eyes again." It wasn't until the next day, after Erin had left, that Abby remembered her dream, the pale hand hovering, almost floating at the top of the stairs, in the very spot where Erin had fallen. Had the hand been trying to point, to let her know that something was going to happen there? Almost a week later, Abby and Erin and Holly Roselle, another friend, were sitting around the table in Abby's kitchen, studying for a test in social studies. They tried to study in Abby's room, but, like Erin, Holly couldn't stand the doll's eyes. "They're awful," she'd said. "It's like they're watching me all the time." So the three of them had taken their books into the kitchen. "I never do any good on these essay tests," Holly complained. "How do we know what to study for if we don't know what the questions are going to be?" "I know what you mean," said Erin, who was at the refrigerator, pulling out a bottle of soda. Abby stood beside her at the counter, refilling the bowl of popcorn. Holly was still sitting, her elbows on the table, her chin in her hands. The light from the hanging lamp overhead made her dark hair gleam. Abby turned to say something to her, and that's when it happened. There was no time for a warning. 1 second the stained glass lamp was hanging from its chain above the tabletop, and the next second it was dropping straight down, crashing with a shattering of glass onto Holly's head. It was Erin who pulled the lamp away, Erin who started to wipe the blood away from Holly's face, and then ran to get Abby's mother. Abby had screamed when the lamp fell, but after that she was silent, paralyzed, looking on in horror as her mother calmed Holly down so she could look at the gash on her head. Abby heard her mother say she didn't think it was as deep as it seemed, that head cuts always bled badly. She watched as her mother and Erin helped Holly up, heard her mother say she'd take her home. She watched it all, but at the same time she was remembering. The lamp was spinning so fast that the light from the colored glass panels swirled and blended together into a crazy pool of color on the shining tabletop. Abby watched it go around faster and faster until she was dizzy from watching and had to look away. Then she heard the sound. Not a gasp, really, just a soft intake of breath, coming from somewhere near the lamp. She looked back, and there was the hand, white and delicate, reaching toward the lamp. At the touch of a slender finger, the lamp stopped spinning. Then Abby heard another sound, a sigh as soft and delicate as the hand, a sigh of satisfaction. She dreamed it the night before. Now, looking at the book spattered with dark red drops of Holly's blood, Abby shuddered and closed her eyes. She'd been warned. She'd been warned in her dream, but she hadn't remembered in time to help. Holly needed 4 stitches in her head, but she was all right. Even so, Abby couldn't forget what had happened or what she dreamed. That was when the dreams began to haunt her, when she tried to keep her eyes from closing at night, afraid of what might happen after she dreamed again. But she had to sleep, and when she did dream again, it was worse, much worse. Not the dream, but the reality. The horrible reality that Abby didn't see until it was almost too late, until she woke one night to the sound of her mother's voice, hoarse with fear, shouting for Abby to come help her. Abby stumbled across the room and pulled open the door, saw her mother's back disappearing down the stairs. Barefoot, her mind still cobwebbed with sleep, she followed Denna down and out the back door into the cool night air. The crackling sound was soft, almost soothing. The smell reminded Abby of summer camp, but there was nothing comforting about the sight of the flames licking at the bottom of the boards. Abby stopped, frozen in horror for one painful second, then rushed after her mother across the weedy backyard toward the burning treehouse where Lindsay lay sleeping. For Lindsay, the reality of Abby's third dream was agony, the agony of scorched flesh in her shoulders and back and hands. Denna cried when the doctors said Lindsay was lucky. They were first-degree burns. She could have died, but she'd live. No one knew how the fire had started. The treehouse was close to the street that ran near the backyard, and Denna thought that some idiot must have tossed a match from a car. But Abby knew better because she'd seen it. She'd seen it in her dream. Hours before her mother's cry had pulled her from her sleep, she'd seen the match, not tossed from a car, but torn from a matchbook and struck into flame by a slender white hand. Sitting in a hospital room, with Lindsay sleeping in the bed and her mother dozing fitfully in a chair, Abby tried to gulp back the tears, but she couldn't. Her shoulders shook, but she cried silently, the tears spilling from her eyes and dripping from her chin onto her clenched hands. After a while, she wiped her cheeks and held her hands in front of her face. Small but wide, with blunt, squared-off fingertips like her father's. Not like the dream hands, delicate and pale and deadly. Whose hands did she see in her sleep? Another week went by before Abby dreamed again, a week when the weather turned cooler and the leaves on the trees dropped down in bushels. Lindsay was much better, but she didn't go in the backyard, and there was no talk of building another treehouse. No one talked of the fire, but everyone remembered the horror of that night and how close Lindsay had come to death. Abby went to bed each night afraid to sleep, and dragged through the days wondering what she'd see when she did sleep. She knew she'd dream again, and she was terrified of what would happen. Mark Halpern bought her a Coke after school, and Abby was too tired and too worried to even try to have a good time. No one was more surprised than Abby when he asked her out for Saturday night. "I'll pick you up about 7:30, he said as they stood on her front porch in the late afternoon. He smoothed back his dark blonde hair and smiled at her. "A movie and some food, does that sound okay?" Abby was about to say it sounded great when the front door opened and Lindsay stepped out. She was carrying the doll by one leg. "It fell," she said defensively to Abby. "I was walking by your room and I saw it on the floor." Abby took the doll and smoothed down the heavy lilac skirt. "So why didn't you put her back on the shelf?" "Because I heard you talking and I wanted to know who was with you." Lindsay looked at Mark, smirked, and went back inside. "You like dolls, huh?" Mark asked. Abby laughed a little. "I found her in the attic. She's really old." Mark took the doll in his hands still tanned from the summer, and looked it over. "Nice," he said. He raised his eyes to Abby's face. "But not as nice as you." He shook his head and chuckled, as if he realized how corny he'd sounded. But then he leaned close and touched his lips to Abby's. Abby supposed it was an awkward kiss, with a doll stuck between them, and Abby herself so surprised she didn't do anything but stand there. But it didn't seem to matter. Mark smiled at her again, put the doll in her hands, and headed for his car. He folded his long legs into the tomato red compact, tooted the horn once, and then he was gone. Abby stood still for a moment, hugging the doll against her chest, before she headed into the house. she dreamed again on Friday night. She woke at midnight, her legs tangled in the sheets, the blood pounding in her ears. The sense of danger had been overwhelming, and it stayed with her through the night, snapping her awake every hour until she finally gave up and watched the sunrise through the kitchen window. She could see the hands again, but not only the hands. She could see an entire figure, a small one, maybe a child's. The figure was in shadow, though, and she couldn't tell much about it. Just the delicate hands and the curve of a pale cheek. But it was moving, walking. Abby heard a crunch of gravel on the road, the swish of a dress, saw the tip of a shiny black shoe. And she heard another sound, the sound of breathing that broke into a soft, excited giggle as the figure skimmed quickly along. Then the figure was running down the road, scattering pebbles under its feet, its breath coming faster and faster. Abby could feel her own breathing speed up. She didn't know what was coming. She only knew that it was going to be bad, but she didn't know how bad until she saw the glare of headlights, heard the hum of the engine turn into a roar, saw the small, shadowy figure step deliberately into the path of the oncoming car. Then came the screech of brakes and the sickening sounds of crunching metal and shattering glass. There was a moment of silence, and then came the last sound Abby heard before she woke, a soft, whispery giggle. It was Saturday now, a day when she should have been counting the hours until Mark came to pick her up. Instead, she drifted through the day in a haze of depression, the memory of her dreams hanging over her like a dark weight. Erin had been lucky. She could easily have tumbled to the bottom of the steep stairs and broken her neck. Holly had been lucky too. The glass could have sliced into her eyes or neck, blinding her, killing her. Lindsay might have died in the flames, charred and blackened like the boards of her treehouse. And now this fourth dream. Would Abby read about the crash in tomorrow's newspaper? Would she see the words telling her what she already knew? That there had been a car crash? That someone had been hurt? That maybe a child had been hit? Tired and edgy, Abby spent most of the day moving from room to room, gazing out the windows at Lindsay and her mother who were raking leaves. There had been frost on the ground this morning. Soon the grass would turn brown and brittle, the trees would be empty and skeletal, and the darkness would come earlier and earlier. At 7, Abby took a shower and washed her hair. Under the sharp, hot needles of water, she felt her tense muscles relax a little, and the dull headache she'd had all day started to ease. Wrapped in a thick terry robe, she padded back to her room. She was staring into the closet, her eyes roving over and rejecting shirts and skirts and pants, when she heard the sound. That childish giggle. It was so clear, so close, that without thinking, Abby whirled around, expecting to see someone right behind her. But the room was empty. Shaking her head as if to clear it, Abby turned back to the closet. She was reaching for a dark orange blouse, soft and silky to the touch, when she noticed the time. 8 o'clock. Mark was half an hour late. An hour later, Abby brought the cordless phone into her bedroom and called Mark's house. If she'd stopped to think, she might have wondered about her pounding heart and shaking hands. She might have realized that they were caused by something much more horrible than the fear that Mark stood her up, but she didn't stop to think. So when Mark's mother answered, and Abby asked to speak to him, she was completely unprepared. Abby stood frozen in the middle of her room, while Mark Halpern's mother, her voice thick with tears, told her that Mark was dead, that he died in a hospital that afternoon. "He was driving home from a friend's house," Mrs. Halpern said. He's a good driver, a careful driver, but of course he had to swerve and—" She stopped a moment, and Abby heard her swallow several times. "He was only going 35, at least that's the speed limit there, but the police told us that even at that speed, when you hit a tree—" She stopped again. Abby's mouth was dry when she spoke, her voice cracked. "Why?" she asked. "You said he had to swerve. Why?" "Because of the little girl," Mrs. Halpern said. "When they were putting him into the ambulance, he told them he'd seen a little girl run into the road. He was very clear about it. They looked and looked, but they never found her." Her voice broke completely then, and all she could say was goodbye. Abby switched off the phone and closed her eyes. A wave of dizziness hit her. She knew she ought to sit down before she fell, but she couldn't move. She could only stand there, so dizzy she felt herself swaying. That's when she heard the giggle again, a happy, impish, childlike giggle, and it was close, so close Abby could hear the indrawn breath before it came a second time. Abby opened her eyes but didn't move. She held her breath, waiting, knowing she'd hear it again. When she did, when that eerie, whispery giggle drifted toward her across the room, she slowly turned around and stared into the doll's glittering sky-blue eyes. A little girl in a purple dress, with slender, pale hands and shiny black shoes. Just like the doll Abby had freed from the rubble in the attic, and what? Brought to life? Brought to life so her fine china hands could trip one friend on the stairs, send a lamp crashing onto another friend's head, strike a match and set the treehouse ablaze with her sister inside it, brought to life so she could dash into the road and kill an innocent 16-year-old boy? Then, as Abby stood there, she watched in terror as the doll's eyes changed, came alive, shifted in the lifeless china face, and focused directly on Abby. In the eyes was a look of triumph. It lasted only a second, but that was enough. There was life there, some kind of life, some kind of deadly force that had killed and would go on killing until somebody stopped it. Abby knew what she had to do. Swallowing a scream, she strode to the shelf and snatched up the doll. She didn't look into its eyes again. If there was life there, she didn't want to see it. Sobbing in her need to get rid of it, she thrust the doll into the beautiful wooden box that she'd polished until it gleamed. It looks like a coffin, Abby thought, as she slammed down the lid and pushed the shiny brass catch in place. A satin-lined coffin for a doll. 10 minutes later, Abby pulled her mother's car to a stop up on the cliff road. The box was on the seat next to her. As she reached for it, she heard a sound coming from it, a faint pattering sound like pebbles. It wasn't pebbles, though. It was tiny china fists battering against the wood. Then Abby was out of the car, the wind tearing at her hair, standing at the edge of the cliff with the box in her hands. She didn't hesitate. With all the strength she had, she threw the box over the cliff and watched it, turning over and over, its brass catch winking in the moonlight until it disappeared into the darkness below. Abby stood alone at the top of the cliff. She was shivering from the cold, but she had to wait, had to be sure. Straining her ears, she listened until she heard, faint but distinct, the clattering sound as the box struck the sharp boulders at the base of the cliff. She heard it hit once, twice, 3 times, and then there was silence. It was over. The doll was gone, and Abby turned to go home, knowing she could sleep and never see those pale, deadly hands again. The man had finally pried the latch open, and as he looked inside, he smiled, surprised and pleased. It was funny what some people threw away. He was sure this was a genuine antique, probably worth a lot of money. The hands and face were fine china, and he bet the dress was real satin. They didn't make dolls like this anymore. Antique or not, he wasn't going to sell it. Not with Christmas on the way. Not when he had a daughter who was 9 years old and still crazy about dolls. Yes, this would make a perfect gift for her. With a satisfied chuckle, he tucked the box under his arm and headed home. This has been a Nightfall Audiobooks production of The Doll by Carol Ellis. Hi, this is Chris from Nightfall Audiobooks, and thank you very much for joining me for my production of The Doll by Carol Ellis. I have not read anything by Carol Ellis before. I do like the prologue and the epilogue with the doll in the case banging down the cliff and an old man finding it and opening it. And at first I thought the old man was a vagrant or a drifter, but it looks like he was just, out for a walk, and he finds this box with this beautiful doll inside. He doesn't realize it's haunted, and he's going to give it as a Christmas gift to his daughter. This was well done. I liked the subtlety. I liked how the attacks were happening, but you weren't really sure it was the doll. But then again, who else could it be? This was a classic horror story. I like haunted objects. This reminds me a lot of Annabelle, the famous Raggedy Ann doll that Ed and Lorraine Warren have in their collection to protect it from everyone else. If you remember from the Conjuring movies, Ed and Lorraine Warren were paranormal investigators. Any houses or any disturbances that they investigated, and they found an object to be cursed or possessed, they took it with them to protect so it would never act up again or harm anyone ever again. So this sort of feels like that. I want to read more of Carol Ellis. If anyone has any recommendations on what a good book to read from her would be, I would be willing to entertain it. So what should I read next? I don't know. Send me an email, nightfallaudiobooks@gmail.com. I am also at home right here on YouTube at Nightfall Audiobooks. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit that join button to show your support. Any help is greatly appreciated. I also have a Patreon page, patreon.com/nightfallaudiobooks. So tell your friends, tell your mom, tell whoever you think would like to listen to me tell them tales of horror. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you next time.